right, so for today, we're going to continue our conversation of collective behaviors by specifically looking at riots to describe the acting crowd. All right, we know from what we've studied in sociology so far that there are a lot of outside forces that'll influence group behaviors and change the way that we behave in the moment. So, for example, do you guys remember Ash's conformity study? If you're in a group of people and everyone is giving the wrong answer, even though you know what is right, you'll change your behaviors, you'll change your answers to fit in with that group. All right, so we know the forces of conformity will cause us to abandon what we know is right to do what everybody else is doing in that moment. All right, also remember Milgram's obedience study. That was the one where uh, if you have an authority figure telling you to do something that you think is wrong, you'll go along with their orders, you'll listen to what they're telling you to do, and therefore abandon your individual beliefs to do what you're told by somebody else. Right? So both of these studies, both of these researchers documented the fact that individuals don't always do what they know is right. They don't always do what the expected norms are. So collective behaviors are those moments where we have temporary changes to group behaviors. You guys did a great job on your mind maps from yesterday. I gave you feedback on things that you want to keep doing versus what you want to change for next class's lesson. But you already looked at these different collective behaviors. We know that during fads, people will wear very bizarre things. Rumors, people will believe different facts, different elements, even though it doesn't fully sound correct. And riots, which we're going to focus on today, people will burn and destroy things, even though they know that that's not appropriate. Right? So these collective behaviors look at these outside forces and how they manifest in specific changes to group behaviors. For today's class, I'm just going to look at riots, since we're going to address Kristallnacht. You probably studied Kristallnacht before in your history classes. Maybe you covered it in your religion class. But Kristallnacht was one of the most famous riots that began before the events of World War II. It was during the rise of the Nazi Party into power. They had already begun their persecution of Jewish members within Germany and Austria. And so it erupted in this one violent night where a lot of Jews in their places of worship, their businesses, their homes were targeted and they were destroyed. So we're going to look at what allowed for that one night of violence to occur and how did this kind of unfold around society at that time. When we're looking at why people buy into these collective behaviors, there's this herd mentality that sometimes develops where people aren't thinking for themselves as an individual. It's a thinking of the group and you just kind of go along with the crowd. Maybe you've experienced this before. Have you ever been out with your friends doing stuff and then you know it ended very badly, so your parents are asking you, well, what were you thinking? You kind of weren't really thinking at the time. Right? That's the herd mentality. You're so caught up in the flow of the moment, going along with others, that you don't think about your individual accountability. You just go along with the crowd. Have you ever been at a game and how the wave kind of gets started within the stadium? What starts from people giving up that individual identity and they just see, well, everyone else is standing, so I'm going to stand along with it. And sometimes the energy of that crowd, as they get wrapped up in the game, they get so excited that they buy into this moment. What also allows this to occur is this circular reaction that happens within the collective mind. Right? As the herd develops, people lose their individual mind and they start thinking as the group. And so the circular reaction is this back and forth communication that happens between the individuals of the crowd making decisions and what the crowd decides to do and who they're going to follow. So going back to the other example of the wave. Well, the wave usually gets started because 2 or 3 people in the stadium, they want to get this giant thing going. And so they stand up, they start shouting at the people in their section, we're going to do the wave, and people will either agree and buy in and start doing the wave, or they'll decide they don't want to do this. And so those few people, those few fans got their section to go in, and then it'll slowly move through the other sections, and slowly it'll be able to go all the way around the stadium, right? But who makes the decision for when the wave stops, right? Sometimes it'll go around the stands once, maybe twice, right? But eventually it's going to peter out. The crowd eventually decides that we are done with this game, and so they'll slowly sit down. A few individuals at first stop standing up, and then more and more buy into it. So the circular reaction looks at the influence of a few individuals on the crowd, and also how the crowd decides to, yes, agree with those individuals, or no, abandon those individuals and do something different. And so there's this constant flow of information that comes through the crowd. They look at what facts they're going to believe, what they're going to do. And so it's almost like everyone in the group knows their specific assignment, what they're supposed to be doing, but it's all done without thinking, because this herd mentality, this collective mind, is making the decisions for them. Right? Usually what allows us to understand if people are going to buy into those collective behaviors is something known as Minimax strategy. All right, with Minimax strategy, it states that people will only get involved if the costs to them are low and the rewards to them are high. All right, costs would be things like your time, your energy, what personal risks are you going to be put at, will be a cost to you. So, for example, if you were going to riot, people at Kristallnacht, or your personal case study example of a riot, maybe they didn't want to get involved because it would have been dangerous. They could have gotten hurt. They could have been beaten up. They could have gotten hit by something. Maybe they didn't want to get involved because if they got caught, they could have been arrested. They didn't want that risk of maybe losing a job or not going off to college if this ends up as a criminal record for them, right? Maybe it's like, I'm comfortable sitting at home and I don't want to go out to the streets and riot and burn things, right? So there's time and energy that's required. And if those costs are too high for the individual, well, then I'm not going. Right? But things that would draw me into it, things that would maximize the likelihood of me getting involved, would be the rewards. Right? What benefits do I get from getting involved with this? Maybe it'll be fun. I've always wanted to see what a car looked like on fire, so let's try it out now because everybody else is doing it. Maybe it's a bonding moment. By being part of the crowd, I can be with others and have fun with my friends, and then I can tell the story later on. Versus me missing out. I don't want to miss out and be the one person not here, not doing this. This allows me a chance to unleash my anger. This thing has made me mad for so long that now I can finally destroy it. And so I can target my anger at this specific entity, this specific group, at this specific time. And so those incentives would draw me into the collective moment and therefore maximize the likelihood of that more and more people are going to get involved. So what Burke's Minimax strategy states is that if the costs are too high, it's going to minimize the likelihood of people participating in that collective behavior. But if the rewards are high, that's going to maximize the likelihood of people buying into the collective behavior and that collective behavior becoming very popular. So take a moment and fill in the Minimax part of your worksheet. Right? What are some things that would minimize and decrease the likelihood of people getting involved within your riot? What are some things that would maximize the likelihood of people getting involved within your riot? So use examples either from Kristallnacht, looking at the reading that I gave you if you don't remember what you've studied in your other classes, or you can use your personal case study riot and look at the things that drew people in versus pushed people away from getting involved. And then once you do that, then you can move on with the worksheet. All right, what we're also going to look at is the stages of the acting crowd. All right, Bulmer looked at and tracked the acting crowd, and what he stated is that you can actually see the pressures building for all of these different collective behaviors. We're just going to do riots because it's easiest to see within riots, but you could apply the same ideas to any panic or urban legend or rumor that's circulating within the groups, right? In order for a collective behavior to manifest, in order for an acting crowd to exist, first, we need some element of background tensions. All right, there's things that aren't quite right within society. People are upset, they're disquieted, and so these background tensions are kind of the foundation for any collective behavior to manifest. If we're going to look at the events of Kristallnacht, right, part of the background tension was the high rates of anti-Semitism that were present within Germany and Austria. They were blaming the Jews for the loss of World War I. Germany was in a great economic depression. They had to pay back these reparations for their loss of World War I. So if you were, for example, it was cheaper to wallpaper your house with German money than it was to take that money and go and buy bread. Bread was almost 2 million marks at the time. It was basically $100 bill would be the equivalent of 1 cent. And so not only was there high rates of anti-Semitism, there was a great economic depression, and so people weren't happy about this. Right? What we needed then is an exciting event. Right? With this background tension, there needs to be something to focus the group and get them to finally get off their seats and do something. And so the exciting event is something that startles people into action. Right? With the background tensions for Kristallnacht, right, we know with the anti-Semitism, the Nazis began persecuting Jews. There was an individual, a Jewish individual, who was living in Paris, and his family was heavily persecuted while living in Germany. And this man, he was so upset that he went to the German embassy and he shot the German ambassador. Right? So the Vom Roth shooting is the exciting event. This individual who's living with so much persecution on his family and hearing what they were struggling with, he decided to take action, and so he shot the ambassador. And so the exciting event is this Vom Roth shooting that kind of woke up everybody, and they were fixated on what was happening. Right? After the exciting event, everyone starts to get together, and there's the milling period. Right? The milling period is where people talk about the exciting event and they start to figure out what do they think about it and how do they feel. Right? This is where we see a lot of circular reaction, that back and forth communication between individuals of the crowd and what the herd mentality is going to do. Right? During the milling period, this is where we decide what we're going to do about that exciting event. Right? They could have sided with the shooter. They could have said, well, this is a good thing because what's happening in Germany is bad, and we want to help out the Jews so that they aren't being persecuted anymore. Right? And if that happened, the riot never would have occurred. Right? But instead, what occurred during this milling period is people decided that they were unhappy about what the man did. They thought that the Jews were more to blame than what they originally were, and so there was so much more anger, and it increased the anti-Semitism that was present within Germany. Right, this milling period, it occurs by looking at newspaper articles, and so there were a lot of articles that were targeting the Vom Roth shooting and blaming the antagonizer and saying that this is just because Jews are always angry and they're always aggressive. This was happening within stores and on the streets. And so the milling period is where that collective mind starts to form what they want to do. Right? The collective mind will then come to their common object. Right? The object of attention is what are the specific things that we're focusing on and what is our specific feelings towards those things. Right? So people began to focus on Jewish businesses. They focused on synagogues, and so places where Jews tend to group themselves and organize themselves. Right? They focused on Jewish individuals specifically, right? Those that were living in their community or people that were immigrants and new to the area, right? And they chose those objects to be the release of all of their feelings. Right? Since we know during the milling period people were feeling very angry, well, that common object of attention, when they see those things, when they see those people, they became very angry. And so when we see that common object, Well, then we know what our common impulse is going to be, right? Based off of these common impulses, we're now going to have our new norms. What are we going to do when we come in contact with that common object? And so what people did during Kristallnacht is when they came in contact with those businesses, they broke in and they looted and they destroyed things. When they came in contact with those synagogues, well, they burned it, they destroyed it, they ripped up the holy texts, they would break the windows, right? When they came in contact with Jewish individuals, well, they beat them up, they pushed them to the street, they destroyed their homes. And so what Bulmer's acting crowd states is that in order to prevent any of these collective behaviors from starting, is you need to get involved at that milling period. But if you don't change things then, well then at stage 4 and stage 5, that's when the collective behavior finally starts. And so it's during 4 and 5 that we can actually see the riot taking place. The common object gives me my common impulse, and so when I see those people, I'm going to destroy their things. All right, what we also know in the acting crowd is that they need leaders to follow. All right, we know from Unit 3 that these leaders will direct our behaviors and kind of give us the ideas of what we're going to do. And so there is a new social structure that'll manifest during these acting crowd moments. We look to certain people to decide what our new norms are, and then we copy and mimic those norms. All right, researchers call this emergent norms. Norms that are okay to do within the moment, but not outside of those collective behaviors. If during a riot, it's acceptable to see people set things on fire, break windows, climb lampposts. Right? Those are things that would be very weird if you went out into the streets and did it right now. But during that riot, not that it's good, but it's kind of the acceptable norm. It's normal to see people to do things, so it's not that shocking. And so to get these more emergent norms, we need to look at the new social structure that is kind of manifesting. So I'm going to go through and talk about the social structure, the different people, the different characters that are present within that moment. Right. For Kristallnacht, just write down 2 of the examples that I give, and then the same thing for your selected case study riot. Just pick 2 of yours that you want to use. Right. At the top of our social structure would be the ego involved. Right. These are people that are the leaders of the group. They're the ones that make the decisions. Right. They usually have something directly at stake. They're very concerned about what's happening, and they want to direct the action towards something that will be beneficial for them. So, for example, the ego involved for Kristallnacht, that would be Hitler and the Nazi Party. Right? There were a lot of meetings between Hitler and his advisors after the Vom Roth shooting, talking about what they wanted to do. While they never came out with a specific directive saying, we're going to burn everything on this night, they definitely sent out the message that this was not okay, and it's still the Jews that are to blame for all of this. So the ego involved are the people that kind of have something directly at stake. They're the ones that are most invested within those decisions of the crowd. All right, the concerned are people who are interested. Right, they don't really have something directly at stake, but maybe they care about the ego involved. They are willing to follow orders because they think that ego-involved decisions are the right things to do. So for Kristallnacht, these would be Nazi followers. They aren't the governing heads, they aren't in elected positions like Hitler and his advisors, but they're people within the party. They're people that believe in what Hitler's doing, and they think that this is the right thing to do. And so concerned individuals are part of the acting crowd, and they are listening to the ego involved, but they aren't necessarily the leaders of the event. They're just following what the leaders tell them to do. Right? The insecure, these are people who don't necessarily agree with what the ego involved say is right. They're just kind of taking advantage of the moment. I want to be part of this because being a part of this exciting event right now is letting me gain power or gain a sense of space within this group. And so I join in because I'm too scared not to join in. Right? For Kristallnacht, there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily part of the Nazi party, but they got involved because being seen as part of the Nazis mean I'm not going to be targeted by them, and therefore I'm safer because of that. Right? They got involved because I've always really hated this competitive business, and so this allows me to destroy his stock and destroy his company while protecting my interests. And so the insecure actually don't care about the exciting event and what the ego involved is telling them to think. They're just taking advantage of this moment because they're too scared not to get involved, not to take advantage of this opportunity. We also have curious spectators, right? These people don't care about the common impulse. I'm not actually going to carry out the actions, but I'm still going to be part of the crowd and watching what's happening. During Kristallnacht, there were a lot of newspaper reporters there reporting on the event. And so they're in the crowd and they're watching things getting burned, but they're not stopping the destruction. They aren't helping the victims, but they also aren't burning anything themselves and they aren't destroying anything themselves. There were mothers that took their children out into the street so they could watch history happen. And so they were holding up their children in front of the flames of the fire so that their children could enjoy the sight that was happening. You can see curious spectators a lot in like fights at schools, those students who take out their cell phone and just film what's happening rather than helping stop the fight or getting involved with the fight themselves. Right? So these are our bystanders who are just there to kind of watch the insanity unfold and see what's happening. And then the last ones are the exploiters. Right? These people don't care about anything. They're just there to take advantage of the moment and they want to get some personal benefit out of this. Looting is a good example. There was a ton of looting that took place during Kristallnacht, especially with like the businesses. And so it wasn't that I cared about the Vom Roth shooting. It's not that I'm listening to the ego involved and them telling me what to think and feel. I just really like that fur coat, so I'm going to break into this business and steal it. Right? So these exploiters, they take advantage of the moment in the hopes for them to make money. And so it's very individually focused versus part of the crowd and what the crowd wants out of all of this. All right, so again, I just listed examples for Kristallnacht, so make sure you write down at least 2 examples of exploiters and who they were, the ego involved and who they were, and then take a look at your selected riot case study. Pick 2 of these characters, 2 of these positions in the social structure, and tell me who would be those individuals. Who, either a specific name or a type of people, who would be your concerned, who would be your insecure, the bystanders. So just pick 2 of the acting crowd and add that to your worksheet. If you have any questions about this, again, I'll be online on Zoom at noon, or you can send me an email and I will answer it and help you out with that. All right, thank you so much, guys.